And on her site at the University of UBC, you can find a lot more information and references. Thanks, Sneja.
Thank you.
I think I'll sit down, since this is a much more cozy situation. And first of all, let me thank Renata and Franca for making this possible, that I come here and participate in this very ambitious event. So it's a pleasure to be here. As part of what I thought might make a kind of sense for this kind of context, I'm actually weaving together aspects of European traditions, really more Eastern European traditions and writers, together with the Australian context, right? So it's sort of kind of think of it as braiding together to some degree, right? And you might be surprised at some of the examples, but we can talk about this as to why. The framework for this is the not so new anymore, but what is still referred to perhaps as new debates in cosmopolitanism, about which there has been a lot of writing, and I notice enormous compendii of essays are about to be launched this year. All the publishing houses seem to be producing weighty volumes on cosmopolitanism, which of course incorporates a lot of critical material on cosmopolitanism. Okay? I hope, tell me if I'm going too fast. I hope I'm trying to make this very understandable, so just sort of signal if it's too fast. Okay? And I begin the paper with a sort of a poignant vignette, which is taken from the Australian example just to set the scene. And I'm very grateful for rediscovering the example of Giorgio Mangiamele, who was a filmmaker in Australia in the 50s. And I'm grateful to the author of a dissertation, Silvana Tuccio, who I was asked to assess her dissertation, right? And she wrote her whole dissertation on Mangiamele's work. Very interesting, and not easy to do from Melbourne, I have to say. So the filmmaker Giorgio Mangiamele was marooned in Australia, if you can think of him on a desert island to some degree, in Australia, and struggled for recognition throughout his life. In 1965, his film Clay, called Clay, C-L-A-Y, maps Italian neorealism disconcertingly onto a southeastern Australian landscape, specifically the artists' colony of Montsalvat on the outskirts of Melbourne. Some of you may know this. I do. Part of my past. The film's moody, expressionist choreography of black and white shadows and its highly, to our taste, melodramatic plotline, which is a fugitive running from the police, rescued by a wild girl. She's sort of somehow an undomesticated girl, seems very alien to contemporary Australian audiences. Even the continuous bleak rain that falls throughout the film appears to emanate from Northern Europe. And the police are, a standard fixture in many Australian texts, but the police in this film remind one disconcertingly of a sort of fascist carabinieri. They don't look Australian. No? At the same time, there is no doubt that this film captures something quintessential about the Australian setting and the Australian unconscious, viscerally haunted by its beginnings as a penal colony. Mainstream Australian cultural history is replete with oddly fashioned 18th century and 19th century attempts to capture the landscape and its unique flora and fauna, as mediated through European painterly sensibilities. But what if there had been a recognition of other visual grammars and differently trained aesthetic sensibilities? Mangiamele's work gives us a glimpse of what might have been. And I'm using this example as a way into my paper because I firmly agree with post-colonial theorist Paul Gilroy's contention that cosmopolitanism should include, to quote him, the cultivation of a degree of estrangement from one's own culture and history. This view also resonates with Pnina Werbner's recent work to bring together cosmopolitanism and anthropology in a dialogical endeavor that moves, as she says, beyond the individual. And I use, my title is Cosmopolitan Vernacular, the Vernacular Cosmopolitan. I use vernacular cosmopolitanism as a way of referring to debates that have attempted to move beyond the binary oppositions that have most recently been reinforced by such campaigns as the War on Terror. Cosmopolitan debates over the last decade have attempted to suggest that there are many regimes of knowledge, not in terms of infinitely relativistic values necessarily, but certainly enmeshed in different belief systems, including those supposedly immune realms of science and reason. Thus, cosmopolitanism, in the sense of extending the term to the many groups and classes who have traveled and dispersed widely over the globe over the last century and more, offers exposure to these other ways of knowing. And if there is a receptiveness to what they have to give, this is all to the good. Why vernacular cosmopolitanism? It's an odd conjunction. Because an oxymoron, it's a contradiction in terms that signals an internal contradiction that runs like a comforting fault line through all my work. What orthodoxies does that split undermine at the same time as it gestures towards a potential solidarity? To give this solidarity a particular dynamic, imagining the stranger differs from imagining oneself a stranger and from being interpolated in the Althusserian sense as a stranger. So these 3 points of view will structure my paper. In an earlier paper titled Vernacular Cosmopolitanism, Subaltern Inflections, I looked at the ways in which the new debates on cosmopolitanism functioned in relation to constructions of Europeanness and the West in post-colonial discussion. Within these debates, the West often functions as shorthand for colonial and imperial histories and ideologies, but it is often unclear what or who that term includes. I pose the question, who counts as European, in what periods and what sites, alongside the broader question of what constitutes the human in conjunction with claims to modernity and interiority in a logic where the primitive is all surfaces. First, I cited outlier figures such as Frankenstein's creature or Bram Stoker's Count Dracula as establishing certain unexpected accounts of European subjectivity in the 19th century. Mary Shelley's text created a version of European cosmopolitanism within which England, France, and Switzerland were to some degree interchangeable, as were Turk and Arab in a parallel register. The text also demonstrated a degree of tolerance towards Islam in ways that are at odds with our current era. Count Dracula, on the other hand, was an example of the ways in which the outer reaches of Europe were perceived as contaminated by so-called Oriental elements, the threatening Mongol hordes and also Judaism, that were placed in opposition to ethno-nationalist models of purity. We are still haunted, increasingly perhaps, by these allegories, subsequently reclaimed and reworked by diasporic writers in the so-called New World, who cast unexpected illuminations on what it meant to be European and who counted as European in varied imagined geographies, including the settler colonies. For example, I analyzed the ways in which Greek-Australian writer Christos Tsiolkas and his text Dead Europe was animated by the desire for Europe to be dead for the diasporic community, since it was associated with the toxic legacies of anti-Semitism, blood feuds, homophobia, and so on, the yoke of old histories and moribund models of familial and social relations. In this paper, I will be looking more specifically at the ways in which the dyad of European and cosmopolitan resonates in relation to so-called Eastern European writers and texts that deploy Eastern European protagonists. I will explore the often abjected figure of the so-called Eastern European in recent texts to examine whether an interior complexity and a kind of cultural franchise is extended to such figures. The recent award of the Nobel Prize for Literature to Herta Müller, a Romanian-born German, alerts us to this reanimated interest in Eastern European perspectives and formations. But first, a little detour to further examine what I mean by that curious term, vernacular cosmopolitanism. In my earlier paper, I cited Tim Brennan's critique of cosmopolitanism, in which he states that, to quote, its covert appeal is most powerful when, in a double displacement, its political sense is expressed in cultural forms. Typically, cosmopolitanism constructs political utopias in aesthetic or ethical guise so that they may more effectively play what often proves, on inspection, to be ultimately an economic role. So there is that sense, Tim Brennan suggests, that cosmopolitanism exists as a kind of sugarcoating to globalism and the economic constraints that globalism, in a sense, conveys. This statement sounds in part like the familiar leftist suspicion of any reference to culture as being automatically culturalism. That in a sense you can't talk about culture, it's always something that hides something else, some kind of pragmatic realism. Right? The fear that they function as fetish to occlude political investments. You think too perhaps of Etienne Balibar's notion of racism as the racism without race argument that deflects racist claims onto cultural difference. You know, Balibar's argument saying, I don't object to your cultures, I don't object to your race, but let's all remain different. You know, it's that sort of racism that hides behind a kind of tolerance. It's not that I'm arguing that such concerns are without merit, but they invariably consign, and this is sort of speaking to Renata's introduction, they always consign cultural analyses to a somewhat bleakly reified domain, that you can't talk about culture, it's always hiding something else. Right? In this instance, the counter-tactic I'm suggesting consists of disaggregating cosmopolitanism by attaching it to an impossible qualifier, the vernacular. The concept of vernacular cosmopolitanism reaches towards global contexts and responsibilities at the same time that it recognizes that these are always rooted in and permeated by local concerns. The oxymoronic nature of the phrase reflects the double movement within these debates. The American critic Sheldon Pollock points out that by including both the privileged world of the Greek polis and the Roman verna, or house-born slave, the phrase purposefully signals its inherent contradiction. And this is precisely its appeal. In Homi Bhabha, who may have coined this term, the vernacular cosmopolitan, in Homi Bhabha's terms, the concept attempts to capture, to quote him, the growing global gulf between political citizenship, still largely negotiated in national and status terms, and cultural citizenship, which is often community-centered, transnational, diasporic, hybrid. Bhabha also associates this concept with minorities who don't necessarily wish to claim majoritarianism and whose defining impetus is that of translating across cultures in an economy marked by iteration rather than teleology. The way Bhabha structures these arguments pertains to his familiar dyad, the performative and the pedagogical nation, in which adding to does not mean adding up. A comparable argument occurs in Paul Gilroy's desire for a cosmopolitanism that encompasses a new planetary consciousness, whose antecedents he locates, for example, in Montesquieu's 18th century satiric text, Persian Letters. Discrepant modernities are the general context, and vernacular cosmopolitanism in Bhabha's and Stuart Hall's sense is the direction of this model, which includes the marginalized and wretched of the earth. And it's in relation to that last point that Peter Neyer's work on abject cosmopolitanism is of interest.